I never thought my company's bankruptcy party would lead me to love. Damn, even saying those words feels surreal. There I was, Riley Brooks, standing in my once bustling textile restoration workshop, now eerily quiet except for the sound of packing tape and occasional forced laughter. At least we're going out with style, Sarah, my assistant, tried to joke while boxing up our specialized tools. The autumn breeze through the broken window blinds made the Farewell Brooks Restoration banner flutter sadly. 15 years of building this business, gone in an economic downturn. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my career breathing life back into damaged fabrics, yet couldn't save my own company. My brunette hair was messier than usual, and my green eyes were tired from nights of paperwork. "Hey boss, remember when we restored that 1,920 seconds flapper dress?" Tom called from across the room. The owner cried when she saw it. I managed a smile, remembering better days. We'd transformed countless treasured pieces in this space. The farewell party was my idea. Stupid, perhaps, but I couldn't let it end with just locked doors and empty rooms. We deserved better. The cheap champagne flowed as we shared memories and hugged goodbye. By midnight, I was alone in the workshop. My fingers traced the smooth wooden workbench where I'd spent countless hours hunched over delicate fabrics. The moonlight cast strange shadows through my grandmother's magnifying glass, my first restoration tool. I couldn't face going home to an empty apartment. The neon sign of Starlight Diner beckoned like a lighthouse in the darkness. At a.m., Cape Coral was quiet, but this place never slept. "Coffee black," I told the waitress, sliding into a worn leather booth. The diner hummed with late-night energy truckers, night shift workers, and lost souls like me. I was staring into my coffee cup like it held answers when a voice broke through my thoughts. "Mind if I share your booth? It's packed tonight." I looked up, ready to refuse, but the words died in my throat. She stood there, blonde hair slightly wind-blown, blue eyes bright despite the late hour. Something about her presence made the harsh diner lights seem softer. "I'm Victoria," she said, sliding into the seat across from me before I could respond. Little did I know that this chance meeting, born from the ashes of my professional life, would change everything. But that's getting ahead of the story. Right then, I was just a failed business owner sharing a booth with a stranger at 2 a.m., not knowing I was about to embark on the most unexpected chapter of my life. The fluorescent lights of Starlight Diner cast a dreamy glow over Victoria's features. She ordered coffee and a slice of cherry pie, then turned those piercing blue eyes on me. "You look like you've had quite a day." I let out a hollow laugh. Try quite a decade. The coffee was bitter, but I welcomed its familiar burn. Something about the late hour and the strange liminal space of an all-night diner made honesty easier. "I'm a museum curator," Victoria offered, cutting her pie into precise triangles. "Cape Coral Museum of History. We just received a collection of colonial-era textiles that's giving me headaches. The universe has a twisted sense of humor." Here I was, drowning in the failure of my textile restoration business, and across from me sat someone who worked with exactly the kind of pieces I used to restore. "Textile conservation issues?" I couldn't help asking. Professional curiosity died hard, apparently. Victoria's eyes lit up, and she launched into a description of deteriorating silk and compromised embroidery that would have bored most people to tears. "You know your stuff," she said, studying me with new interest. "Most people's eyes glaze over when I talk about textile degradation patterns." Hours slipped by like minutes. We discussed everything from conservation techniques to our favorite midnight diners across the city. Victoria's hands moved expressively as she talked, her wedding ring noticeably absent despite the tan line on her finger. "Divorced," she said, catching my glance. 2 years ago. He couldn't understand why I'd rather spend time with old clothes than at his law firm parties. The sky outside was turning pearl gray when our waitress Marie brought our 5th coffee refill. "You two are still here?" She chuckled. "Must be some conversation." Victoria's cheeks flushed slightly. "I should probably head home. Some of us have work in the morning." She paused, then pulled out a business card. "But I'd love to continue our discussion about textile conservation sometime." I took the card, trying to ignore how my fingers tingled when they brushed against hers. The embossed lettering read, "Victoria Robinson, Chief Curator." Below that, she quickly scribbled her personal number. "Call me," she said, standing up. "Even if you just want to talk more about 18th century threading techniques." Her smile held something more than professional interest, but I was too exhausted to analyze it. I watched her walk away, her blonde hair catching the first rays of sunrise through the diner windows. The card felt heavy in my hand, like it carried the weight of possibility. Marie appeared with the check, a knowing look on her face. That's the first time I've seen Victoria share her booth with anyone. She comes in here most nights, always sits alone. I stared at the business card, tracing the embossed letters with my finger. The universe had a strange way of working. Yesterday, I was a failed business owner saying goodbye to my life's work. Today, I was watching the sunrise after spending hours talking to a beautiful museum curator who shared my passion for historical textiles. Maybe endings weren't always what they seemed. Sometimes they were just different kinds of beginnings in disguise. I stared at Victoria's business card for 3 days before finally calling. The museum's marble halls felt worlds away from my defunct workshop, but here I was, following a security guard to the curator's office. Victoria looked different in her professional environment. Her blonde hair was pulled back in an elegant twist, and her tailored blazer screamed authority. But her smile was the same as that night in the diner. "I have a proposition for you," she said, leading me through climate-controlled storage rooms. "We received this collection of wedding dresses spanning 3 centuries. They're in terrible condition. The dresses hung like ghostly remnants of past love stories. I couldn't help reaching out to touch a deteriorating lace sleeve. This is Belgian bobbin lace, probably 1850s. The deterioration pattern suggests improper storage." "Exactly why I need you," Victoria said, standing close enough that I could smell her subtle perfume. "Would you consider consulting on the restoration project?" My heart did a little flip. "I don't have a workshop anymore," I reminded her. The words still tasted bitter. "We have a conservation lab here. It's yours to use." Her blue eyes held mine. "I've researched your work, Riley. Your restoration of the governor's wife's inauguration gown was brilliant. We spent hours examining the collection. Victoria's knowledge of historical context complemented my technical expertise perfectly. When our hands accidentally touched over a delicate embroidered bodice, neither of us pulled away immediately. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm. I'd arrive at the museum early, losing myself in the intricate work of bringing these treasured garments back to life. Victoria would bring coffee and sit watching me work, asking questions that showed her genuine interest. "These dresses all tell stories," she said one evening as we worked late. "Each stitch, each repair, speaks of the women who wore them." I looked up from the beadwork I was stabilizing. "What story would your wedding dress tell?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. Victoria's fingers traced the neckline of an 1890 gown. "A cautionary tale about marrying the person you're expected to, rather than the person who makes your heart race." The air between us grew thick with unspoken words. The conservation lab's soft lighting cast intimate shadows, and the historic dresses surrounding us seemed to hold their breath. "And what about you?" she asked softly. "Any wedding dress stories?" I shook my head, focusing intently on my work. Never found the right person. Or maybe I was too busy building a business that ultimately failed. "The business may have ended," Victoria said, her hand covering mine on the workbench. "But your talent didn't." Late nights at the museum became our normal. We'd order takeout and eat among the artifacts, sharing stories and professional insights. Sometimes our conversations would drift into personal territory, and I'd catch Victoria watching me with an intensity that made my skin tingle. One night, as I was locking up the lab, Victoria leaned against the doorframe. "You know, these dresses aren't just about preservation, they're about transformation. About becoming something new while honoring what came before." I looked at her, really looked at her, and understood she wasn't just talking about the dresses. We were both transforming, becoming something new in these quiet museum hours. The wedding dress collection was coming back to life under my hands, but something else was awakening too. Something that made my heart race every time Victoria entered the room, something that made me linger longer each evening, finding excuses to stay just a few more minutes in her presence. It hit me during a routine conservation meeting. Victoria was presenting our progress to the board, her hands moving gracefully as she explained the historical significance of each restoration. I found myself watching her lips move instead of following her presentation. "Riley?" Her voice snapped me back to reality. "Would you like to explain the technique you used on the 1920s beadwork?" I stumbled through my explanation, hyper-aware of her presence beside me. The board members nodded approvingly, but Victoria's knowing smile suggested she'd caught me staring. Later, in the lab, she handed me a magnifying glass, our fingers brushing. The contact sent electricity through my arm. "You seem distracted today," she said softly. "Just tired," I lied, focusing on the delicate lace before me. But I couldn't focus. Victoria had rolled up her sleeves, revealing elegant wrists as she sorted through fabric samples. The museum became a maze of moments that left me breathless. Victoria leaning over my shoulder to examine a stitch, her perfume making me forget basic conservation techniques. Our hands meeting over coffee cups in morning meetings. The way she'd touch my arm to get my attention, letting her fingers linger just a second too long. One evening, she invited me to her apartment to review documentation photos. Her home was exactly as I'd imagined, elegant but comfortable, with art books scattered everywhere, and a vintage textile fragment framed like precious art. "Wine?" she offered, returning from the kitchen with 2 glasses. The sunset through her windows painted everything golden, including her blonde hair. We sat on her couch, photos spread between us, but the images blurred as I noticed how the evening light caught her blue eyes, how her lips curved when she smiled. "This restoration project," she said, setting down her wine. "It's been different with you here." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Different how?" She moved closer, the photos crinkling beneath her. "I've never met anyone who sees these pieces the way I do, who understands that they're more than just old fabric." The air grew thick with possibility. Her hand found mine on the couch cushion, our fingers intertwining naturally. Time seemed to slow down, marked only by our increasingly shallow breaths. A car alarm shattered the moment. We jumped apart, laughing nervously. Victoria tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture I'd come to find endearing. "I should go," I said, gathering my things. "Early morning tomorrow." But I lingered at her door, neither of us quite ready to end the evening. "Riley," she called as I headed down the hallway. I turned back. "I'm glad you're here, not just for the project." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every touch, every loaded glance, the way she said my name, the feeling of her hand in mine. The next morning, I arrived early to find Victoria already in the lab. She was examining a wedding dress under the magnifying lamp, her face serious with concentration. "Morning," I said, my voice embarrassingly husky. She looked up, and something in her expression made my stomach flip. We worked in charged silence, hyper-aware of each other's movements. When she reached past me for a tool, her arm brushing mine, I forgot how to breathe. This was dangerous territory. She was my client, technically my boss on this project. But watching her that morning, sunlight streaming through the conservation lab windows and catching the gold in her hair, I realized I was already falling. And judging by the way she kept stealing glances at me when she thought I wasn't looking, I wasn't falling alone. The weather forecast called it the storm of the decade. I was carefully wrapping a restored wedding dress when Victoria burst into the lab, her usual composure replaced by urgent energy. "Hurricanes changed course," she said, already pulling on protective gloves. "We need to move everything to the secure storage room. Now." The next hours were a blur of careful packing and moving. Outside, the sky turned an ominous green-gray. Victoria coordinated with security, while I supervised the transfer of our most delicate pieces. "That's the last of the wedding collection," I said, placing a carefully wrapped package in an acid-free box. Thunder crashed overhead, making us both jump. "The emergency generators should kick in if we lose power," Victoria assured me, but her voice held a note of worry. "You should head home before it gets worse." As if on cue, rain began pelting the windows with violent force. "I'm not leaving you alone with these pieces," I insisted. "Besides, my car's probably underwater by now." We worked our way through the basement storage area, checking humidity monitors and reinforcing protection for the most vulnerable artifacts. The storm raged outside, but in here, among centuries of preserved history, it felt almost peaceful. Until the lights went out. The darkness was absolute. I heard Victoria's sharp intake of breath somewhere to my left. "The generators should start any second," she said. They didn't. "Don't move," I called out, fumbling for my phone. The weak light illuminated Victoria's face just a few feet away, closer than I'd realized. "The emergency exit is locked during power outages," she said quietly. We're stuck here until they restore power or someone comes looking. My phone light caught the worry in her blue eyes. We were alone in the basement storage room, surrounded by priceless artifacts in complete darkness. At least we're in good company, I joked, gesturing to the wedding dresses. A flash of lightning illuminated the room through the high windows, making the covered forms look like ghostly brides. Victoria laughed, but it was shaky. Not fond of storms? I asked softly. Not since I was a kid, she admitted. Another crash of thunder made her step closer to me. I could feel the warmth of her body now, smell her familiar perfume. Tell me about the dresses, I said, trying to distract her. The stories behind them. In the dim phone light, she began pointing out different pieces, her voice growing steadier as she shared their histories. We sat on the floor, backs against a storage cabinet, phones providing just enough light to see each other's faces. That one, she pointed, belonged to a woman who called off her wedding the night before. She donated it to the museum still in its box. Sometimes the best endings are the ones that never happen, I said quietly, thinking of my own failed business, of her failed marriage. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief illumination I saw Victoria looking at me with such intensity it stole my breath. The thunder that followed seemed to shake the building's foundation. She reached for my hand in the darkness. Riley, she whispered, and my name on her lips sounded like a question and an answer all at once. I'm not sure who moved first, maybe we both did. But suddenly her lips were on mine, soft and uncertain at first, then with growing confidence. The storm raged outside, but I barely heard it over the sound of my own heartbeat. When we finally pulled apart, the emergency lights flickered to life, catching the flush on Victoria's cheeks and the slight tremble in her hands as they cupped my face. I've wanted to do that for weeks, she confessed, her thumb tracing my lower lip. Why didn't you? I asked, still dizzy from the kiss. She smiled, leaning in again. I was waiting for the perfect storm. The museum's annual fundraising gala was in full swing. I adjusted my emerald green dress, feeling out of place among Cape Coral's elite. Victoria had insisted I attend as her guest, though we'd been careful to maintain professional distance in public. The restoration project is the highlight of tonight's exhibition, Victoria said, appearing beside me in a stunning black dress. She handed me a champagne flute, her fingers lingering against mine. The wedding dress collection, now fully restored, drew admiring crowds. I stood back, watching Victoria charm potential donors with stories of each piece's history. She was in her element, elegant and commanding. Victoria Robinson, a male voice cut through the crowd. Still playing dress-up with old clothes? I turned to see a tall man in an expensive suit approaching. Victoria's posture stiffened. James, she said coolly. I didn't expect to see you here. Her ex-husband. He looked exactly like the type who'd dismiss historical textiles as old clothes. His eyes swept over me dismissively. And who's this? Riley Brooks, our textile conservator, Victoria said, stepping closer to me. She's responsible for the restoration work you see tonight. James's lip curled slightly. Ah yes, the bankruptcy case. News travels fast in small towns. I felt Victoria tense beside me. Before either of us could respond, a local reporter approached. Ms. Robinson, could we get a photo of you with the collection? And perhaps Ms. Brooks as well? The next morning, our photo was in the Cape Coral Herald. Victoria and I standing close, too close, beside the wedding dress display. The caption mentioned our unique partnership, but it was our body language that spoke volumes. My phone started ringing early. Former clients, colleagues, all suddenly curious about my connection to the museum's chief curator. The whispers started in the conservation lab too. I caught assistants falling silent when I entered rooms. Ignore them, Victoria said when I mentioned it. But I saw how the gossip affected her. She started maintaining careful distance at work, our easy intimacy replaced by professional courtesy. Things came to a head at a board meeting. James had apparently been busy, spreading insinuations about Victoria's personal interests affecting museum decisions. The board is concerned about potential conflicts of interest, she told me later in her office, voice tight with anger. They're questioning my judgment in hiring you. Because of my failed business? Because of us. She ran a hand through her blonde hair. James is friends with half the board members. He's suggesting I let personal feelings override professional standards. So we'll be more careful, I said, reaching for her hand. Keep things strictly professional at work. Victoria pulled away. It's not that simple. The museum's reputation. Damn the reputation, I interrupted. What about us? She looked at me then, blue eyes bright with unshed tears. I've worked 15 years to build my career here. I can't let anyone question my integrity. And I can't go back to pretending I'm just your employee. The words hung between us like shattered glass. That night, I worked late in the lab, losing myself in the familiar motions of restoration. When Victoria appeared in the doorway, I knew from her expression that something had changed. The Chicago Museum of Natural History called, she said quietly. They're offering me a curator position. Better funding, bigger collection. My hands stilled on the fabric. When do they need an answer? By the end of the week. She stepped into the lab, but kept her distance. It might be for the best, a fresh start. I thought of that night in the storm, of kisses in the dark, of how quickly happiness could unravel. Is that what you want? Victoria's silence was answer enough. I carefully put away my tools, each movement deliberate and final. When I walked past her to leave, she caught my arm. Riley, she whispered, but I couldn't bear to hear what came next. I left her standing there among the wedding dresses we'd restored together, each one a testament to loves that had survived or failed. I wondered which story ours would become. A week passed like a fever dream. I threw myself into work, taking on private restoration projects from home. My dining room became a makeshift workshop, but every needle and thread reminded me of Victoria. Sarah, my former assistant, brought coffee one morning. You look terrible, she said bluntly. I saw the museum article. I focused on the delicate lace before me. It's complicated. It's only complicated because you're both making it complicated. She picked up a swatch of silk. You know she hasn't accepted the Chicago position yet? My hands froze. How do you know that? Tom's sister works in HR at the museum. Victoria's been missing deadlines, something she never does. Sarah gave me a pointed look. She's waiting for something, or someone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I drove to Starlight Diner, where it all began. Marie was working as always. Haven't seen you two lovebirds lately, she said, pouring my coffee. She's moving to Chicago, I said, the words bitter as the coffee. Marie snorted. That's not what she told me last night. Sat right there in your booth until sunrise, looking like someone killed her dog. I stared at the empty seat across from me. The same booth where I'd first seen those blue eyes, heard that laugh. I can't ask her to risk her career. Honey, Marie leaned over the counter. Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking one at all. The next day, I went to the museum. Victoria's office was dark, but I found her in the conservation lab, surrounded by papers. She looked up, startled. Her blonde hair was messy, dark circles under her eyes matching mine. Riley, she breathed. Don't go to Chicago, I said before I could lose my nerve. I have to think about my career. But her voice wavered. No, you have to think about your life. I stepped closer. We restored those wedding dresses together, Victoria. Each one tells a story about choosing love over expectations. It's not that simple. It is. I reached for her hand. Your ex-husband, the board, they only have power if we give it to them. I lost my business, but I found something more valuable. I found you. Victoria's fingers tightened around mine. I haven't accepted the position, she whispered. I know. I pulled her closer. Because you don't want to go. The gossip won't stop. Let them talk. We'll give them something worth talking about. A tear slipped down her cheek. I'm scared, Riley. When James left, I promised myself I'd never risk my career for love again. This isn't the same. I wiped away her tear. We're not hiding who we are. We're choosing who we want to be. She looked around the lab at the pieces we'd restored together. I built my life here. Then let's build something new together right here. I took a deep breath. I'm not asking you to choose between your career and me. I'm asking you to choose happiness. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her blue eyes searching mine. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the lab windows, the same windows where we'd first worked together, where I'd first realized I was falling for her. Finally, she spoke. I already told Chicago no. My heart stopped. When? Yesterday. She gave a watery laugh. I couldn't imagine walking into a conservation lab that didn't have you in it. I pulled her into my arms, feeling her tears against my neck. Around us, the preserved wedding dresses stood silent witness to another love story finding its way. We'll figure it out, I promised, holding her tight. Together. She pulled back just enough to look at me. Together, she agreed, and kissed me like she was finally coming home. 3 days passed without word from Victoria. I'd thrown myself into a private restoration project when my doorbell rang at midnight. There she stood, rain-soaked and breathless. I did something crazy, she said, pushing wet blonde hair from her face. I just finished a 6-hour board meeting. I pulled her inside, grabbing a towel. Victoria, what's going on? She paced my living room, leaving damp footprints on the hardwood. I told them everything. About us, about James's manipulation, about how their prejudices were driving away talent. My heart stopped. How did they react? They fired me. She laughed, a wild, free sound. Then I quit before they could finish firing me. Victoria. I reached for her, but she held up a hand. Let me finish. I presented them with a proposal first, for an independent textile conservation studio partnered with but not controlled by the museum. Her blue eyes sparkled. They rejected it, of course, so I showed them the offer from the Metropolitan Museum. I sat down hard. The Met? They've been watching our restoration work. They want us, Riley, both of us, as independent contractors, not employees. She knelt before me, taking my hands. But I turned them down too. You what? My head was spinning. Victoria, that's the Met. I have a better idea. She squeezed my hands. Remember that empty storefront on 3rd Street, the one with the perfect natural light and high ceilings? I nodded, beginning to understand. I bought it. Well, put a deposit down. She bit her lip. We could open our own gallery. Restoration studio in the back, exhibition space in front, private clients, museum contracts, teaching workshops. That's insane. But I was already imagining it. We'd need startup capital, equipment. I sold my house. She said it casually, like she hadn't just upended her entire life. The divorce settlement, too. It's enough to get us started. You can't risk everything like this. I'm not risking everything. She cupped my face. I'm investing in us. I kissed her then, tasting rain and possibility on her lips. When we parted, she rested her forehead against mine. Say yes. The board will never work with us. They will when they see what we can do. James's influence only goes so far. She smiled. Besides, 3 other museums have already expressed interest in our services. I looked around my makeshift home workshop, at the half-finished projects and dreams I thought had died with my company. You really want to do this? I want to build something with you. She stood, pulling me up with her. Something that's ours. We stayed up all night planning, spreading ideas across my dining room table, Victoria's professional contacts, my technical expertise. A space where we could work without hiding, teach others our craft. Dawn found us curled together on my couch, surrounded by business plans and sketches. Victoria was half asleep against my shoulder when she murmured, I never thanked you. For what? For showing me it's okay to choose love. She lifted her head, eyes serious. For making me brave enough to build a new dream. I kissed her softly, feeling the promise of tomorrow in her smile. Outside, Cape Coral was waking up, unaware that in a small living room, surrounded by threads of the past, 2 women were weaving their futures together. We should celebrate, Victoria said suddenly, sitting up. Marie's probably opening the diner now. I laughed. Same booth? Same booth. She stood, pulling me up. But this time, I'm not pretending I don't want to kiss you over coffee. We drove to Starlight Diner as the sun rose, holding hands across the console. Sometimes the best decisions are made at midnight, I thought. Sometimes the craziest risks lead us exactly where we're meant to be. Opening day of Threads Through Time dawned clear and bright. Victoria and I stood in our newly renovated space on 3rd Street, morning light streaming through the tall windows. It's really happening, I whispered, squeezing her hand. The gallery space gleamed, our first exhibition of restored vintage textiles arranged like art installations. In the back, our state-of-the-art conservation studio waited for its first official projects. Ready? Victoria asked, reaching for the door key. Her blonde hair caught the sunlight, and I remembered that first night in the diner, never imagining we'd end up here. The opening crowd exceeded our expectations. Local media, museum representatives, and curious residents filled the space. I watched Victoria charm potential clients, her passion for textile history infectious. "Remarkable work," a distinguished woman said, examining a restored ball gown. "I'm Catherine Walsh, from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. We'd love to discuss a potential partnership." More opportunities followed. A wealthy collector wanted us to restore his grandmother's trousseau. 2 universities asked about workshop sessions. Even some of Victoria's former board members attended, their presence a reluctant acknowledgement of our success. "They're talking about us," I murmured to Victoria during a quiet moment. Around us, whispers and glances followed our movements. She smiled, adjusting a display. "Let them talk. We're making history, not hiding from it." That evening, after the last guest left, we celebrated with champagne on the gallery floor. Victoria had moved in with me 2 weeks ago, another step forward we'd taken without looking back. "Remember when you thought your bankruptcy was the end?" she asked, tracing patterns on my palm. "Now look at us." The space around us held our shared vision, part museum, part workshop, part teaching center. But more than that, it represented our choice to build something together despite the whispers and raised eyebrows. "Ms. Brooks?" A young woman had appeared at our door. "I'm sorry, I know you're closed, but..." She held up a carefully wrapped package. "It's my mother's wedding dress. Could you restore it?" Victoria and I exchanged glances. Our first after-hours client. "Come in," I said, recognizing the hope in her eyes. "Tell us its story." Later that night, we added her dress to our project board. "Our first official commission as business partners," Victoria said proudly. "Just business partners?" I teased, pulling her close. She laughed, kissing me softly. "Life partners who happen to run an amazing business together." The next weeks flew by in a blur of restoration work and client meetings. We developed a rhythm, Victoria handling the historical research and client relations, while I focused on the technical restoration work. Word spread about the same-sex couple revolutionizing textile conservation in Cape Coral. Some clients came specifically because of who we were, others despite it. We welcomed them all. One afternoon, I found Victoria in our workshop, carefully documenting a restoration process. "Move in with me permanently," I blurted out. She looked up, surprised. "I practically live with you already." "I mean, officially. Let's sell my place, find somewhere new, together." Her smile lit up the room. "I thought you'd never ask." That evening, we closed the gallery early and walked to Starlight Diner. Marie served us coffee in our booth, beaming like a proud mother. "To new beginnings," Victoria raised her coffee cup. "And old endings that led us here," I added, thinking of that first night, when my world seemed to be falling apart. Outside, Cape Coral continued its quiet evening rhythm. But inside our gallery on 3rd Street, among preserved threads of history, we were writing our own story. One stitch, one day, one brave choice at a time. The invitation to Victoria's family Thanksgiving dinner arrived on a crisp November morning. I found her in our home office, staring at vintage textile photographs. "We don't have to go," she said softly. "My parents are traditional." I wrapped my arms around her from behind. "They're your family, and I'm not hiding anymore." The Robinson family estate sat on the outskirts of Cape Coral, all manicured lawns and old money. Victoria's hand trembled slightly as she rang the doorbell. "Victoria, darling." Her mother's smile froze slightly when she saw me. "And, Ms. Brooks, how unexpected." The dining room could have hosted a state dinner. Victoria's father sat at the head of the table, her brother and his wife on one side, leaving us to face her mother's questioning gaze. "So, Ms. Brooks," Mr. Robinson broke the awkward silence. "Victoria tells us you're in the textile business together. Please, call me Riley." I felt Victoria's hand find mine under the table. "We've built something special at the gallery." "Yes, we've heard." Mrs. Robinson's tone could have frozen wine. "Such an unconventional arrangement." Victoria straightened. "Our arrangement, Mother, has attracted clients from 3 countries and 5 major museums." "But dear," her mother pressed, "surely you miss your position at the museum? The respectability." "I respect myself now," Victoria interrupted. Riley taught me that's worth more than any title. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, unexpectedly, Victoria's sister-in-law spoke up. I'd love to see your gallery. Those wedding dress restorations in the Cape Herald were stunning. Slowly, the conversation shifted. Victoria's brother asked about conservation techniques. Her father, a businessman at heart, grew interested in our international clients. By dessert, Mrs. Robinson had thawed enough to ask about our teaching programs. My garden club might be interested, she admitted reluctantly. Walking to our car later, Victoria let out a shaky breath. That was progress, I finished, pulling her close. The next week brought unexpected support. The local arts council featured us in their winter showcase. 3 prominent families commissioned restorations. Even James's influence in the museum board seemed to wane as our reputation grew. Look at this, Victoria called from her desk one morning. The email was from a major art magazine requesting an interview about revolutionizing textile conservation in the digital age. They want to photograph us together, she read, as partners in business and life. I remembered our early days of careful distance, of professional facades. What do you think? She answered by kissing me, right there in our gallery window where anyone could see. The article came out a month later. The photos showed us in our element working side by side in the conservation lab, sharing quiet moments in the gallery. The writer captured our story with unexpected grace, focusing on our expertise while acknowledging the barriers we'd broken. Threads through time isn't just preserving history, the article concluded. Brooks and Robinson are making it. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from LGBTQ+ artists and historians. A teenage girl wrote about wanting to study conservation after seeing our story. We did this, Victoria whispered one evening as we closed up the gallery. We chose us, and look what happened. The Cape Coral art community embraced us fully after that. Our holiday exhibition opening became the event of the season. Even Victoria's mother attended, bringing her entire garden club. I'm trying to understand, she told Victoria quietly. I pretended not to hear them near the champagne table. You seem happy. I am, Mom. Victoria's voice was steady. Happier than I've ever been. Later that night, in our favorite booth at Starlight Diner, Victoria traced the rim of her coffee cup. Thank you, she said suddenly. For what? For being worth the risk, for helping me find my courage. I reached across the table, taking her hand. Around us, Cape Coral sparkled with holiday lights, no longer a place of whispers and shadows, but home. Our home. 1 year to the day after my company's bankruptcy party, I stood in our gallery preparing for a special exhibition. Threads of Transformation celebrated not just restored textiles, but the stories of change they represented. Ready? Victoria appeared beside me, looking radiant in a vintage-inspired dress she'd helped restore. Her blue eyes sparkled with a secret I couldn't quite read. The gallery filled with familiar faces. Sarah and Tom from my old workshop, now part-time instructors in our conservation programs. Marie from Starlight Diner, proudly showing off the restored 1,950 seconds waitress uniform we'd done for the diner's display. Victoria's parents arrived early, her mother actually hugging me. The garden club ladies can't stop talking about their restoration workshop, she confessed. Even James appeared briefly, nodding stiffly before leaving. His presence no longer held any power over us. Could I have everyone's attention? Victoria's voice carried across the gallery. A year ago today, a company died. She found me in the crowd, smiling. But something much more valuable was born. She moved through the exhibition, stopping at each piece to share its story of transformation. The wedding dress that survived a hurricane, the theater costume that toured Europe, the christening gown passed through 5 generations. These pieces remind us that endings are often beginnings in disguise, she continued. That what seems broken can become beautiful again. She stopped beside a covered display case I hadn't noticed before. Riley, would you join me? Curious, I made my way through the crowd. Victoria took my hand, her fingers trembling slightly. This piece has a special story, she said, removing the cover. Inside lay a familiar sight, my grandmother's magnifying glass, my first restoration tool, but it had been transformed, mounted on a custom stand with an engraved plate. I leaned closer to read the inscription, "Will you marry me?" The gallery fell silent. I turned to find Victoria on one knee, holding a vintage ring box. "You taught me that love is worth any risk," she said softly. "That true restoration isn't about erasing the past, but building something stronger from it." Through tears, I saw the ring, a delicate antique piece we'd admired in an estate collection months ago. "You restored it," I whispered. "Just like you restored my faith in love." Her voice wavered. "Riley Brooks, will you build forever with me?" "Yes," I breathed, pulling her up into a kiss as the gallery erupted in applause. Later, after the celebrations wound down, we walked along Cape Coral's waterfront. The setting sun painted the sky in colors that reminded me of aged silk. "A year ago I thought I'd lost everything," I mused, playing with the ring on my finger. "I never imagined bankruptcy would lead me to you." Victoria laughed, pulling me close. "Sometimes the universe has better plans than we do." We ended up at Starlight Diner, sliding into our booth as Marie brought champagne instead of coffee. "On the house," she winked. "Been waiting a year for this moment." "To new beginnings," Victoria raised her glass. "To beautiful restorations," I added. Outside, Cape Coral continued its evening dance. But inside, in the same booth where our story began, we were writing its next chapter. Among the threads of history we preserved daily, we had woven something timeless, a love story that, like the finest vintage textile, would only grow more precious with time. "Take me home," Victoria whispered, her blue eyes full of promise. Home. Not just a place, but a feeling. A restoration more perfect than any we'd ever achieved in our workshop. A masterpiece we'd created together. Stitch by careful stitch, choice by brave choice. And this was just the beginning.